Reform. It is wonderful. Thank you very much. It is wonderful to have this opportunity tonight to have an evening on proportional representation. Thank you, all of you in Victoria, for joining us, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in from home. It is fantastic to be able to deliver this to you tonight. I'd like to thank, again, Sunset Labs for presenting us with this wonderful opportunity. Thank you very much, Sunset Labs. Before we begin in earnest, it's important that we take a moment to acknowledge that we are gathered here tonight on the traditional territories of the Songhees and Lekwungen people, whose relationship with the land continues to this day. So we should keep that in mind going forward as we are dealing with the future of governance in this province and very well be in Canada. So thank you very much. All right, we're going to get started in just a moment in earnest, but before we do, a few housekeeping things. We have food and beverages at the back and outside if you're interested, as well as a small table with literature if you'd like to get more information, if you're not already swamped and overloaded with all of the wonderful lineup of presentations that we have. So feel more than free to go speak with our volunteers in between or after we are done here tonight. All right, everyone looks ready and geared up and good to go? Yes! That's wonderful. All right, so without any further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, a woman who needs little introduction. She is the Member of Parliament for Saanich-Gulf Islands. She was on the Special Federal Committee for Electoral Reform. Please, everyone, put your hands together for Elisabeth May.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm really pleased to be able to join everyone here today on National Indigenous Day. So I've just come from Indigenous gatherings near the BC Royal Museum, and I'm pleased we've already acknowledged territory, but we're on the traditional territory, of course, of the Esquimalt, the Songhees, First Nations, and the Coast Salish peoples. The reason I'm really pleased to be here is that we have the referendum ahead of us. I don't think there's anybody in this space right now, tonight, and I hope who are watching us as this is being live streamed, who are unaware of why it really matters that the referendum carry and the voters of British Columbia say no to first past the post. But let me run through some of the reasons quickly, and I'll apologize ahead of time. One of the reasons I have to run through the reasons quickly is that I have another constituency event that I have to reach this evening, so forgive me for speaking and running, as it were. The work I did on the Special Parliamentary Committee on Electoral Reform was hugely helpful to me in learning even more about why I didn't want first past the post to be our voting system in Canada. I have had that view, I think, all my adult life. It's been very clear that first past the post produces distorted and perverse results. But I'm increasingly aware of how very dangerous it is, and that's something that I think we need to share. Going into this referendum campaign, a lot of the conversation, and I think you'll know, you've had this experience yourself, I'm pretty sure, descends very quickly into a discussion about what do you think? Do we prefer single transferable vote? What do we think about mixed member proportional? Which system would work best among the family of consensus-based proportional representation systems? And for people who haven't given it a lot of thought at all as to why we would want to get rid of first past the post, we've lost them before we start. Because the question of why would we want to change the existing voting system is what I think our conversation should be all about from now until people get their ballots and start mailing them in. We need to raise the level of awareness of why our voting system needs to change. It's not a question of there's a theoretical better system out there if we were in a utopian frame of mind. No. It is inappropriate, unacceptable, and dangerous for a modern democracy to use a voting system that allows the popular vote to diverge quite sharply from the seat count. So I'll go back and just say some of the things that I've learned while I was on the Special Parliamentary Committee on Electoral Reform. By the way, our report is available online from the House of Commons. I think the committee did a tremendously good job in reporting what we heard from the experts. And we went right across Canada, every province and territory, but we also brought in to us, basically, as tonight we're bringing people to us, through video. So we had video feeds and video links with experts on electoral systems from Ireland, from the UK, from New Zealand, from Germany, from all around the world, and from the US. The leading expert on electoral reform, in my view, is Professor Arndt Liebhardt, who is originally Dutch, who's a professor emeritus at Stanford University, and who's really crunched the numbers. So if you want to have in your back pocket all the arguments you need to dispel the myths about how proportional representation isn't a good system, please pick up Professor Liebhardt's book, Patterns of Democracy, because what you will find there is proof, not opinion. You'll find that Professor Liebhardt looked at, I think it's 40 modern democracies over a 65-year period of time, crunched all the numbers from every election, and is able to, and he grouped voting systems in two categories. And I think this language is also helpful. So first past the post and ranked ballots, he grouped as majoritarian winner take all. And then all the family of proportional representation systems he grouped as consensus-based decision-making. And what he found was, as a matter of crunching the numbers and evidence, the things we all know, the things that have been on Fair Vote Canada's website forever, in countries that have proportional representation, which is, of course, the majority by far of modern democracies. It's the exception and not the rule that still uses first past the post. But the majority of modern democracies use proportional representation, and we all know, I think we know it, you get higher voter turnout when people know their vote's going to make a difference. That's logical. The efficacy of the vote is a significant factor. We also know we get more women elected in parliaments with proportional representation, more diversity, more Indigenous people, more people of color. Yes, we all know that. But here's some stuff I didn't know till I went through to Professor Liebhardt's research. You get more stable government. You get less time between, more time between elections, in other words. More stable government. You get better environmental protection, stricter protection of the environment as an absolutely provable empirical fact from those countries that use a voting system that is consensus-based and fair. And the last one's the real kicker. You get better economic performance from countries where proportional representation is used. And you might wonder, why would that be? I mean, I thought about it. And the interesting thing, by the way, Professor Liebhardt is wonderful because initially in his research, he was sure proportional representation wasn't a good idea. He was convinced by his own evidence gathering. So he's a very strong source of the arguments for why PR systems, consensus-based systems, are better. And he went at it to try to figure out why all this was. And of course, we'll know this as Canadians. One of the things that creates the downsides of first past the post, and there are many, but one of the downsides is that Canadians very rarely actually go into an election keen to vote for someone. Based on first past the post and knowing how it's all going to work out, Canadians go into an election at the point they really can't stand it anymore, try to figure out how to vote strategically, so-called, to kick the bums out. I mean, that's the universal term used by academics. That's how Canadians vote. So you get tremendous swings every 9 to 10 years or longer, where they've suddenly said, I can't take it anymore, I'm going to vote to get rid of so-and-so. In the end, of course, all those years of feeling your vote doesn't count reduces voter turnout. So first past the post is not a good system to promote a healthy democracy. But this is why it's increasingly dangerous, particularly for a country like Canada. Unlike the US, and thank goodness when you think about it, in the US, there's separation of powers. A lot of Canadians think Canada must have separation of powers. We hear about it in school, TV news. We don't have separation of powers in Canada because we didn't have a revolution. We kept the monarchy and Westminster parliamentary democracy, which means that unlike in the US, where the president controls the executive, but not the legislative branch, in Canada, a prime minister with a majority of the seats controls executive, and legislative. I remember trying to explain this before, when I was at Sierra Club, before I joined the Green Party or was in politics at all, trying to explain to a group of US activists who were all working together to try to stop the expansion of transnational corporate rule through so-called trade deals. And they said to me, wow, in Canada, is there a risk of them going to fast track? I said, that's all we've got. We only have fast track. A prime minister with a majority already controls the legislative and the executive. We don't give that enough thought in Canada. What it means, of course, is that if a prime minister is put into power when his or her party has a minority of popular support, but ends up winning the majority of seats, which is only possible under a majoritarian winner-take-all system, that person then has 100% of the power immediately. There is no negotiation of fast track, right? So it's when I say it's dangerous because a party and a party leader who do not have an agenda shared by the majority of Canadians has all the power, 100% of the power, to implement that agenda. Now, we lived through this with Stephen Harper. Harper's agenda was radically different from that of the Liberals, the NDP, or the Greens, or for that matter, the Bloc. And when the Conservatives finally got their majority government, and we all know this, it was 40% of the popular vote of the 60% of Canadians who voted. So roughly 25% of Canadians really wanted the government they got. And the rest of us watched a majority decide to take apart our environmental laws, cancel climate action. When Professor Peter Russell, who's Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto, was testifying, he's one of the leading experts in Canada on Canadian democracy, our Constitution, Westminster parliamentary democracy, and he was asked by one of the Conservatives on our committee, name one thing that's ever gone wrong because of our voting system. Our voting system is wonderful. Name one piece of damage you can point to that ever happened because of our voting system. And Professor Russell said, well, climate change. The majority of Canadians wanted climate action, and then the Conservatives started yelling over him, but he kept saying, look, we had a majority support for climate action, majority supported Kyoto, and Stephen Harper legally withdrew Canada from Kyoto. We're the only country in the world to have done that, by the way. Would never have been possible without first past the post. Now, we weren't the first parliamentary committee to study the question of our voting system. The first parliamentary committee, I could do it just for audience participation here, because I'm sort of ranting at you. Anyone happen to, Fernando probably knows, what year was, you can't answer, what year was the first time that a parliamentary committee studied whether we should get rid of first past the post? 1921, winner in the first row. Yes, correct. Hello, Sonia. Sonia Firstenow has joined us. Hooray! So, in 1921, which was also the year that Ireland adopted single transferable vote, and I can tell you why that was, because I found that out on being on the committee. In 1921, the first parliamentary committee to study our voting system studied first past the post and concluded it was inappropriate for Canada, that it would skew results, that it would only work in a country that only had two parties. And since Canada, since the early 1920s through till this very day, has never had fewer than 3, 4, or 5, and sometimes more in the Parliament, first past the post was a completely inappropriate system. There has never been, from 1921 till today, any independent body, whether appointed by a provincial government, chosen as a citizens' assembly, such as in Ontario or in BC, made up of experts like the Law Reform Commission of Canada. There have been many reviews of our voting system. New Brunswick government did one. You can find there are many of them. One thing they all have in common, none of them recommended keeping first past the post. But after they make that recommendation, the powers that be in the larger parties manage to kind of steer it back to the status quo. Now, why do they do that? Because the big parties, and federally I'm looking at the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, they like the throw the bums out system because eventually it'll be their turn again. They don't really, I hate to say this, it's not true of the individuals within these parties. I hasten to add, there are many fine people found in all parties. But the backroom boys who are figuring out when they're going to get power again, who run their political party with the goal of winning, and seem to have forgotten why they'd want to win. What's the public policy objective? It doesn't matter, we want to win. First past the post suits them down to the ground, because eventually it'll be their turn again. Now, why is this system so very dangerous? Well, we're having a rise, and it may come in waves. This may not be the world's most dangerous crop of leaders, but I have to say I think it's more dangerous than ever because the stakes are higher. We must deal with the climate crisis. We need responsible, grown-up people who are motivated by what's in the best interests of the people they represent. And that's true for fighting poverty, that's true for expanding our medical system to include pharmacare, it's true for many issues. But we have a crop of people who are generally referred to as populists. I don't quite agree with that term. I think of Tommy Douglas as a populist, but never mind. Donald Trump is referred to as a populist. Jason Kenney is referred to as a populist. Doug Ford is referred to as a populist. Now, Doug Ford's big win in Ontario was with 58% voter turnout and 40% of the vote. If you look at the popular vote, there wasn't that much daylight between how the NDP did and how the Conservatives did. But there's a massive difference in seat count because, again, first past the post skews the difference, distorts how people voted from how many seats were won. Now, I mentioned I'd come back to Ireland. Why did Ireland get single transferable vote proportional representation in 1921? Well, it's because they were getting their parliament for the first time. And the parliament at Westminster was going to give Ireland a parliament. And the parliament of Westminster had primarily, of course, at that point, all men, all British ruling class, so guess what? Not many Catholics. And they were very concerned about the minority of Protestants in Ireland and would they be treated fairly. So they invented proportional representation to protect the Irish minority of people like them. But they kept, for the Parliament of Westminster, a skewed voting system. I thought that was really rather remarkable. And over all the years since 1921, single transferable vote has delivered proportionality. So in this election, I think when you look at what's dangerous, how do you inoculate yourself against some future version of Donald Trump running as the leader of a federal party with the risk of becoming prime minister and getting a false majority again and 100% of the power? The only way to inoculate our system, to protect ourselves from someone whose policies are not shared by the majority, but who can force them down our throats because they win a majority of the seats, is to fix our voting system so that we can, we could always end up with a terrible person who doesn't represent, say, my values. That's fine if it's in a democracy, the majority of the people voted that way. But it is fundamentally anti-democratic to allow a majority, quote-unquote, win of the majority of seats in a parliament by a party unable to win the majority of votes, or at least the plurality of votes. And that's the big risk. We will also, of course, have fairer, more collaborative politics. We won't have all this wedge issue and dog whistle politics, all that really nasty partisan stuff, elbows out all the time, is rewarded by first past the post. Collaboration, cooperation across party lines in our current system is not only discouraged, it's punished. So I'm begging of all of you tonight, and I'm going to pass the microphone on to the next speaker, to please use every possible moment between now and the referendum to, number one, learn as much as you can about the system. I recommend, again, the committee report from the Special Parliamentary Committee on Electoral Reform. I recommend Professor Liebhardt's book, Patterns of Democracy. I recommend that you become your own expert and tell all your friends. Talk to everyone you know. and make sure that when those ballots are mailed out, because I don't know what the Elections BC material is going to look like, I hope it's excellent. But don't let yourself, it's my tactical advice, don't let yourself be sucked into ideological warfare of MMP versus STV versus dual member. Just focus on one thing and one thing only. First past the post is far too dangerous in the 21st century. It wasn't a great system in the 18th century, wasn't great in the 19th century. Showing wear and tear and want to get rid of it in the 20th century, absolutely. But in the 21st century, first past the post represents a danger to our survival as a civilization on this planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth May. For those who don't know me, my name is Ronnie Earnhardt. I'm the chair of the Greater Victoria chapter of Fair Vote Canada, and very happy to have you all here tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce Natalie Chambers. Natalie is an environmental activist. She's an organic farmer, and she's currently running for municipal council in Saanich, so keep that in mind. I'd like to thank Natalie for donating a copy of her book. So I want to encourage everybody to stick around because we have some really fun stuff coming up. We have a game show, and her book's going to be one of our prizes, and we got other cool prizes. So without further ado, I welcome my dear friend Natalie to the stage.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here today. As a result of last night, I am carrying notes today. So my name is Natalie Chambers, and I feel very grateful to live here in the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Sahis and Esquimalt. And in my playbook, that gratitude translates as action. I never would have guessed it has taken so long for Canada to achieve the true democracy that is possible through PR. We have been waiting a very long time for this change. In fact, I find it absolutely shocking. In 2014, I was reading some statistics that I found very unusual, and that was 90% of British Columbians interviewed considered themselves environmentalists. And that, to me, was shocking because although 73% of the people opposed the trophy hunt, it continued. 90% of the people opposed the ALR being dismantled, but guess what? It was dismantled. 70% of people, my husband says never talk about numbers, but tonight I am. 70% of people in this province opposed Site C, and guess what? It went through. And now we know the largest opposition in British Columbia is to this pipeline that is being put through the Salish Sea. And, you know, we really don't want to see that be another collateral damage of our broken voting system. So, here in the rain shadow of the Cascade and Olympic Mountains in the territory of the Strait Salish, we live in a globally significant marine and biological diversity hotspot. It's really great to live here, but it is a true responsibility. This is the habitat, the federally listed critically endangered habitat of the southern resident killer whale, but it is also the oil accumulation zone if we have an oil spill. And for many of us, it's not about if, it's about when. And we just cannot allow that to happen. So, however, I'm still proud of Canadians and I'm proud of British Columbians, and Elisabeth May is a very good example of how hard British Columbians and Canadians have worked, because even with flawed democracy, we were able to get Elisabeth May and many others recently. So I think I look to the world and I think, what would be possible if our voting system was working and what we could achieve together then. So, I believe that the only way in which we are going to be able to protect this very, very important endemic biodiversity and our home sweet home here nestled in the Cascades is by adopting PR. We must protect our home in the Salish Sea. So when the referendum happens and the ballots come around, please, please, everyone, please vote for PR. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie. It is now my pleasure to introduce Sonia First to Know. Sonia is a Green Party MLA for the Cowichan Valley. She's the House leader for the Green Party, and she played a key role in the NDP Green Working Group on electoral forms, so she has a particular interest in this issue. So I'd love to hear, without further ado, what Sonia has to tell us about PR.
Thank you so much. And I too want to acknowledge we are on the territories of the Algonquin-speaking people, Songhees, Esquimalt, First Nations, and especially today on National Indigenous Peoples Day. Let's remember that we are on land that has been occupied for tens of thousands of years by other peoples. I actually want to start, I see my friend Alex, who I went to university to become a teacher with, and it's really nice to see you, Alex. And I am a teacher, and when I was a teacher, which I'm not doing right now in a classroom, but I used to say, how do we feel about story time? And my class would always say, yeah, story time. So a little bit of story time. I decided to run for provincial politics, as I'm sure all of you know, because of what was happening in our community of Saanich Lake. And as a community, we came to a very distressing realization that the government, who we should have been able to count on, to rely on to protect us, had actually put us in peril by issuing a permit to put 5 million tons of contaminated soil at the headwaters of our drinking watershed. And the realization for our community and for me was the prime motivation to want to get involved into the provincial level of politics. And I also see Gary Holman. Nice to see you, Gary. And it was a realization that that Saanich was not an isolated case. Saanich was a symptom. And it was a symptom of a set of policies that had been introduced by the government that made it possible for a company to hire its own experts and for those experts to inform the government on whether or not a project was reasonable or safe or acceptable in a community's drinking watershed. And that model was called professional reliance. And I realized that I really wanted to get involved in provincial politics because I wanted to actually solve that problem. And this year has been very much about that, and there will be a report coming out on professional reliance, I'm happy to say, very soon. And I really look forward to that report and the recommendations that will come with it. But how does this connect to First Past the Post? Well, much like what Elisabeth was talking about, when we have electoral systems that deliver all of the power to one party for 4 or 8 or 12 or 16 years at a time, those parties forget that they are responsible to the citizens, not to their donors, not to their own party. They are responsible to citizens. And what we have seen under First Past the Post is a forgetting of what democracy really should be about. And it really needs to be about service to the citizens that you represent as an elected person. And so what do we see with First Past the Toast? And in addition to thinking about stories, I think about democracy. It's been a theme in my whole life. My father took me to East Germany when I was 10 years old. I went behind the Iron Curtain in 1980. I saw the opposite of democracy. And that has informed my lifelong interest in the preciousness of democracy and the importance of democracy. And under First Past the Post, when we see 40% of the vote deliver 100% of the power to one party, when we see safe ridings where it doesn't matter how you're going to vote because you already know which MLA is going to get elected in that riding. And then when we see swing ridings where the parties come in and they make all the promises in those ridings because they just need a few percentage of the voters there. And then the policies are based on those promises as opposed to policies which should be based on long-term thinking about what we need to do to get us to where we should be as a society, as a province, as a country. These are the failures under First Past the Post. And then more importantly, we see a lowering of voter turnout. We see an increase in cynicism. We see young people saying, I don't even know if I care about democracy anymore. And this worries me deeply. More than that, it's what happens in our communities in the face of negative campaigning, in the face of the idea that we have to engage in strategic voting because under a First Past the Post system, if there's more than two parties, then suddenly you have to decide who you're voting against instead of who you're voting for. And that played out very much in Cowichan. It also played out in Saanich-Gulf Islands. We had communities that are very united, that work together. When it's not election season, man, are we ever good at being together in a united community. And then suddenly the election campaign came along, and it was like, you are in my tribe or you are not a person to me. And people were unfriending each other on Facebook, and people were getting in arguments, and how could you possibly vote for this person, because if you vote for her, you're going to elect Christy Clark. And then you go into the polls, and you don't choose the person you really want to vote for. Maybe you don't even choose the second person you really want to vote for. You choose the third person because you're so afraid. And you come out of that polling station and you don't feel excited about the future. You don't feel like you've invested in a vision that's been put forward by a party. You feel like you've made some kind of compromise. And that eats at the core of democracy. Because eventually you get tired of making compromises. And maybe you just stop showing up. This is an extraordinary opportunity we have right now to not only have these discussions and these debates about democracy, but actually to participate in the shaping of what our democracy is going to look like in British Columbia. That is an opportunity afforded to almost nobody in history. And we might have had it a few times here in BC, but statistically, the number of citizens who have been asked by their governments, hey, what kind of electoral system would you like to see for your future? That doesn't happen. And we have to embrace the extraordinary moment that we're in and not let the cynicism pervade it, not let the fear come in, not let the arguments about which system, because once we get a better system, we're going to get better at being able to discuss how to improve on that. So maybe we don't bring in the absolutely perfect system after this referendum, but we will have governments that are going to be more capable of being collaborative, more capable of finding the values that we share as opposed to the things that divide and unite us. And we will be more capable of doing that thing that we need to be doing as elected officials, the service to you, and most importantly, to future generations. And so I say, be excited. This is amazing. This is historic. Your grandchildren and their children will look back at this time and say, the province came together, they stood up, they decided what was best for us, and they worked together to achieve it, and it will be something that we can be so incredibly proud of. And I can't wait for this to unfold. I can't wait to feel more optimistic about the future of our democracy, and I can't wait to work with everybody to make this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Our next speaker is Laurel Collins. Laurel is an instructor of social justice studies, political sociology, and social inequality at the University of Victoria. She is also a co-host of Shaw's Voting for Change, which I would highly recommend checking out if you haven't yet. Can I get a big hand of applause? Laurel! Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jake. Jake is also a host of Voting for Change. He's doing amazing work. So when I was first asked to come be a guest speaker here, I was asked to tell a personal story, and I immediately said yes. I always want to be talking about the upcoming referendum. I think it's really important that we're having these discussions. But when I actually sat down to think about what I was going to say today, I realized there wasn't actually one story that galvanized my interest in this or that got me involved. That actually, it's always made kind of intuitive common sense that if you get 40% of the vote, you should have 40% of the seats and get 40% of the power. Not like, has been mentioned, Doug Ford, who gets 40% of the vote, 61% of the seats, and 100% of the power. So it's not one story, but I do have a number of moments, a number of smaller stories that have made me so passionate about this issue. And the first one comes up frequently because I do teach at the University of Victoria, and you heard the courses. My students are very engaged. The kind of students who choose to take a political sociology class or a social justice studies class, they already want to be there, they already want to discuss these things. But even there, even amongst that very engaged cohort of students, I have students telling me that they don't vote, that they don't feel engaged, they don't feel inspired, either because they are strategically voting, they're voting for a party that they don't really like because they really don't like this other party they think is going to win. And that's not an inspiring way to vote. It's not a way to get people engaged. It's definitely not a way to get young people engaged. And I think we have an opportunity here. Having proportional representation could dramatically change our voter turnout, and especially the way young people engage in our democracy. The second story is actually a little bit similar to the Iron Curtain, going behind the Iron Curtain. I went to northern Uganda, and when I went there, I was working with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And I was there during the Walk to Work riots. It's kind of like the Arab Spring for Uganda and Kenya. And opposition MPs, members of parliament, were walking to work in protest of the rising cost of food and fuel. And in this peaceful walking, the government cracked down hard. And the government there President Museveni has been in power for over 30 years, and the elections are marred with opposition suppression. And so I got to witness the way in which a government suppresses opposition, and the military was brought in. The town that I was in went up in flames, and the military came in and people died. And it had a profound effect on me. And coming back to Canada, it made me even more committed to ensuring that we have a strong democracy, that we are actually working to improve our democracy. And with proportional representation, we have this opportunity to have people be engaged in a new way, to have people be committed to democratic principles. And then the last thing is that I am a woman who has considered running for political office. And when I first started thinking about this, I've worked on political campaigns before, I didn't want to. I didn't want to enter into this kind of winner-takes-all, this vicious, especially you see it in partisan arenas where people are willing to do anything to win that 100% of the power. And I think if we want women to be involved in politics, or anyone of any gender who doesn't fit into that stereotypical, masculine norm, that we actually need to change the way we do things. And we have to do politics differently, and that takes system change. And that's, not to mention the fact that in general, the research shows that more women are elected under proportional systems, that system change alone elects more women, and we need that in Canada. On a federal level, we have 25 to 26% of our MPs are women, when they actually make up half of our population. So this is desperately needed. We're doing a little bit better here in BC in terms of the representation of women, but still we have never had a province in Canada where we've actually had anywhere close to representative in our parliaments or in our legislatures. And so I want to wrap up first by echoing what Elisabeth said about the way in which we are communicating our message. And it really has to be that regardless of the system, we have two questions on the ballot. And the first one is the most important question. It's, do we want to change to a proportional system? Do we want that principle of proportionality? And that is what we need to focus on. The second question, which voting system do you want? I encourage people to look into it, do your research, but really, any of those three options are a million times better than the system that we have right now. So ultimately, it's going to be up to the voters in BC to make this decision. But I hope that you will join me in raising awareness about this referendum and in raising awareness about the need for change in our electoral system. Thank you. Can I steal one of those glasses upstairs?
I think it's not working? No problem. Thank you so much, Laurel. All right, before we get going with our next guest, I would like to remind you that this is going to be running straight, and if you need to go use the washroom or if you want to grab snacks, feel free. We won't hold it against you. I won't. The director might. But anyway, if no one else has anything, on with our next guest. I would like to invite to the stage former MLA for Saanich North and the Islands, Gary Holman. Welcome.
Thanks, everyone. I realized I'm a little underdressed for the occasion, but that's hopefully okay among this crowd. I also wanted to relay some personal experience. As an MLA in a legislature that was elected under first past the post, not in this current pretty rare circumstance where we have an alliance, a collaborative government, a partnership in which people can see firsthand how a government can be formed and how it operates under proportional representation. Actually, in terms of winning this referendum, this is a very good thing. Doug Ford is the other good thing, unfortunate for Ontario, but fortunate for us because it shows in sharp contrast on Ontario, another situation in which you have, in my view, an extreme government being elected, 100% of the power with 40% of voter support, versus a fairly rare situation in British Columbia where you have a partnership that truly does represent more than 50% of voters, and people can actually see how governments can be formed and how they can work together. It's not that there aren't tensions, it's not that there aren't disagreements between the Greens and the NDP, but it's a real live demonstration of how governments can be formed and how they can work for the people of British Columbia. So this is a good thing. It's fortuitous. But the experience I want to relay is the experience I had as an MLA, in which in fact we did have a majority, so-called majority government elected with 45% of voter support, which had 100% of the power in the legislature. And I can tell you, not one amendment, not one suggestion for taking a different direction on proposed legislation or policy or regulation was listened to at all. With the opposition, which represented 55% of voters in British Columbia, had zero authority in that legislature. Now, as a locally elected official, as a candidate in 2009, we've had 2 referenda, as you know, in 2005 and 2009. I supported electoral reform in both those cases because while I could see some issues around proportional representation, the particular system that we were considering, STV, it still seemed a much fairer system than the current one. So I did support it historically, but I can tell you after my experience as an MLA for 4 years, sitting in that place, really truly understanding what a first past the post government really means in our parliamentary system. Our parliamentary system actually can be quite autocratic. It can be very autocratic, and first past the post accentuates that weakness in the parliamentary system. So I saw that for firsthand, and it just strengthened my resolve to change the voting system. I was actually appointed by Adrian Dix, who was leader of the day, as the critic for democratic reform, but it wasn't until John Horgan became leader of the opposition where I actually had a mandate. One of John's first interviews with Vaughn Palmer, I remember it very clearly with Judy Darcy, publicly committed the NDP to putting electoral reform back on the agenda in British Columbia. And all of a sudden, as spokesperson, I actually had a mandate. And so my job was to go out and talk to the public, but talk to advocates, particularly Fair Vote. Fair Vote is distributed throughout the province, to talk to them about, okay, we've committed to this referendum, what should it look like? And the key recommendation that they made and that I came back to John with, and which he accepted, was that if it's going to be viewed by the public as an authentic attempt to change the voting system, we have to change the approval threshold to 50% plus 1. As you know, we actually got 57% in 2005. If it hadn't been for the arbitrary 60% threshold set by Gordon Campbell, I mean, to his credit, he actually put the issue before the people, but if he hadn't set the threshold at 60%, we would have a PR kind of system right now in place. So that was my key recommendation to John. John accepted that, and during the campaign, we committed to that 50% threshold, which for a number of other reasons, including the fact that we've got a real live demonstration of what a collaborative government looks like, and other examples in Ontario, that threshold gives us the best chance, and maybe the last chance we have and will have to change our voting system in British Columbia. So we need to take advantage of this opportunity. Just some other things I wanted to, I guess the other issue I wanted to talk about. The folks in this room were pretty much advocates, I'm assuming, here. But when you talk to folks on the doorstep, that Fernando does, when you talk to folks on the street or in whatever venue, you're talking to people who don't put a lot of thought into the voting system. That, for many people, that's the furthest thing from their mind. So you're going to be talking to those folks cold. And you have to get to them quickly. Your message has to be clear. And unfortunately, the no side, despite the spending constraints that have also been brought in by government, which is also a good thing, the banning of corporate donations, union donations, the limit on personal donations, they will all be in play for this referendum, which is going to make it fair, and which will make our elections fair, regardless of the outcome of this particular referendum. But those organizations are still powerful. Money still talks in this province. Much of the debate is going to be held in the media. Those messages are going to be trickling down to the folks that you're going to try to convince at the door that we need to change our voting system. And there is going to be misinformation that comes up, misconceptions that come up, and the Fair Vote folks tell me, and I agree, you don't want to talk about this. You want to talk about it as an opportunity, not in a negative way, but you have to be able to address that misinformation that is trickling down through the media. The first point is, well, you know, that approval threshold is unfair. It should be more than 50%. And I think you can put paid to that, because most people locally know that 50% is that's the threshold you have to reach to approve significant borrowing in a local community. They get that, they understand that. But you can also use that to pivot, to pivot the point, which is, if you think 50% plus 1 is unfair, then you really must believe that our current voting system is unfair, because it gives 100% of the power with much less than 50%. So you can use the misinformation, politicians call that pivoting, to make the point that you want to make. Another bit of the fear-mongering by the no side is that you're going to elect small fringe parties with extreme views into the legislature. Government has addressed that by setting the threshold at 5%. So as a party, you have to get 5% of voter support, which in British Columbia is well over 100,000 votes, in order to qualify for the proportionality measures in the voting system. So they've dealt with that concern. But again, you can pivot that. You can point to Doug Ford. You can point to Stephen Harper. You can point to so many examples in our parliamentary democracy where you have, at times, governments pursuing extreme agendas with 100% of the authority in Parliament and the legislature with far less than 50% of the vote. So again, you can turn that, this is if it comes up. You want to be, I think, basically making the case that it's a fair system. Every vote counts. You want to be citing the positive aspects of electoral reform, but you have to be able to respond to the misinformation coming down from the top. So those are just a couple of examples. It's a real honor to speak to you tonight. I'm assuming that it was done before, but we need to acknowledge that we're standing on the lands of coastal First Nations who have never ceded their rights to their territory, and it's National Aboriginal Day. So it's quite a fitting occasion. A really honor to speak here. We can win this referendum. We've got the best chance we've ever had to change the voting system in BC, but you have to be prepared to deal with the misinformation coming from the no side, and that's my message tonight. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to introduce now our very own Fernando. He's our canvassing chair. He's very busy out there on the doorstep. And make a little plug. I'm really happy to see you guys tonight, but we are about action. And on our table down here, we have sign-up sheets to join our chapter, so you can find out about events like this and join a wonderful team that Fernando leads. Fernando has kind of a unique perspective on things, being a younger person and an immigrant to this country. So let's hear Fernando, what he has to say.
So, as Ronnie has already kindly introduced me, my name is Fernando, and I want to start by thanking, recognizing that we're in the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and thanking them for letting me on as a guest. I always think that, you know, there's no illegal people on stolen land, and there's definitely, as an immigrant, I think we should thank the people who are the original inhabitants. And for me, I also stand on the same idea of storytelling. For me, why you get somewhere is way more important than anything else. Is what gives you validity in supporting a cause. When you stand at the doorstep and I say I'm supporting X, Y, Z candidate, the stories that I tell, whether I call them a friend, whether I say what my background is gonna change the whole direction of the conversation. And for me, why I'm a supporter of proportional representation, I grew up in Mexico City, and right now we have a federal election underway. And so far, since the nominations have occurred, we have lost a little under 50 candidates that got murdered for voicing their political opinions. And when knowing that 50 candidates got murdered, and knowing that that terrifies me and that I couldn't be involved, I was always very, very keen on seeing a country where I could be. And when I grew up in Mexico City, I always had a rough childhood, and I like to become better and become happier by helping others around me. So I chose to volunteer in an orphanage in Mexico City that was mostly made out of indigenous youth and impoverished youth. So I taught there, I taught music, I taught chess, and it really helped me understand. I went to a private school where most of people were white, and it really helped me understand how the policies that our government was taking weren't actually representative of those people. Now in Mexico we have proportional representation, but it's not a democracy, so it's not very democratic, so it doesn't reflect the will of those people. And I also went to a town in the middle of the mountains once every year to see a community in a city called Tezonapa. Now in Tezonapa there was this kid whose mother had mental health issues and who had 5 children, all of them from different fathers, all of them due to sexual abuse done to her. And she died when he was very young. And my mom and I went to visit him every single day, every single year on his birthday, and we helped him out. And with the equivalent of $30 a year, we actually was a change from when we first saw him, when he was starving literally, to where we saw him, where he was a bright young man. And for me, seeing the privilege that I had coming in as a person who had everything I needed in my life, and for most of my life I didn't know that, and then seeing that and comparing it and saying, it came an epiphany into knowing what I believe in right now, which is we need to use the pain and our own personal stories to empathize with those who are less represented than us, with those who have suffered more than us, but also use our privilege and to help those who have less power than us. Because regardless of whether you are a black woman living in Alabama and you live through enormous amount of discrimination, your life will be better than someone living in South Africa, the same black woman having to walk 4 hours to get water. There's always going to be someone worse off than you. There's one person in this world that doesn't have someone who's worse off than them, and there's close to 7 billion more that don't. So there's always going to be someone who you can help. And then I came to Canada, and I always expected, this country that you see in the pictures of like Banff, and everything perfect, and everyone being friendly, and everything is almost perfect, and everyone is really friendly, and you do say sorry a lot, and you don't need as much maple syrup as I thought, and but it is a great country. But I also came to realize that there were things that weren't perfect. And when I was in school and I learned about the residential schools, it really broke my heart. And I really realized that there were things that in Mexico we did better than here, and there's things that we do worse in Mexico than here. And it really allowed me to see that even though, these indigenous people in the orphanage and these kids living off in the mountain didn't have the proper representation they needed because of systematic racism, because of a non-democratic system, here in the same thing, reserves being trapped in the middle of BC Liberal territory, we're not hearing their concerns. Parliament that for a developed democracy is shamefully low on women and minorities is not hearing their concerns. And for me, really, it's about showing leadership. It's about, I believe in trickle-down change. I don't believe in trickle-down economics, but I believe in trickle-down change. And if Canada can be a beacon of hope in the world, that will lead to countries like mine following a better leadership. And through things like having close relationship in trade and things like that, and right now being Canada having an increase in Mexican immigration, I really see a parallel between helping democracies elsewhere and helping democracies back at home and in the developing world. And the same way that I believe it's hypocritical for the United States to go and invade other countries when their democracy is not right, I also think that the same validity, we can increase the level of democracy in Canada and have a better standing in the world and a more valid voice there. So for me, that is the idea of why I support proportional representation. It's because I am tired and done with taking a look at people who are less powerful, who have a lower voice, and with others who do not realize the privilege that they have, regardless of where they are, because everyone has some certain degree of privilege, and everyone needs to acknowledge that, and everyone needs to use that to help others who are lower than them. And I'm privileged to be here, and I always like to say that I'm privileged to be in a country that is a democracy. It's 99.9% of people living in a developing country don't end up leaving there. And for me, my continuous effort is to make sure that every single moment that I have, I can work for those 99.9% that are still at home, that are still in Africa, that are still in Latin America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernando. Fernando is our door knocking expert, and so speaking about door knocking, I'd like to introduce our next guest is Ben Isett. And how this relates to door knocking is I met Ben because he knocked on my door. He was running for city council at the time. He was really nice. He helped me herd my dog back into the house. We struck up a bit of a friendship, and he really was a trigger getting me into campaigns, municipal and then provincial, and now this campaign. And a year ago, I spoke up at a meeting and I said, Ben, the issue I'd really like to work on this year is proportional representation. And Ben introduced me to some of the key people in this room who got me involved in this campaign and catapulted my efforts and my passions to working on proportional representation. So I would thank Ben for that and like to welcome him to talk to us.
Thanks, Ronnie, and all the volunteers who've put tonight's event on. Today's one of those days in our local democracy when I'm being pulled in about 5 different directions, so I only heard Fernando and didn't get to hear the previous speakers, so I might duplicate some of the material. And sadly, I have to sneak out to another event after my remarks, but I guess I'll offer what I can and then leave you to your deliberations. I think ultimately this debate around proportional representation comes down to whether we believe our province and our country should be governed by in accordance with the principles of democracy, or whether there should be other values or other considerations in terms of determining our system of government. Because right now we have all of these institutional and structural barriers that get between the will of the people as reflected once every 4 years and the composition of the Legislative Assembly. And that's particularly troubling when we think of how top-down our system of government is. Because as we know, the legislatures aren't actually the government. They're a body that the government relies on for support, and under our system of responsible government, the government has to have the majority support of the legislature, but the government itself is selected by the Queen's representative to make almost all of the decisions. Every law that's passed by the Legislative Assembly has to get signed by the Lieutenant Governor. In determining whether or not there's going to be an election. Even with fixed election dates, the actual writs that dissolve the legislature and trigger the electoral process, those writs are signed by the Lieutenant Governor. In the federal realm of power, every appointment of a Superior Court judge, so the BC Supreme Court judges or the Appeal Court judges, and for all the provinces and territories, those are all decisions that are ultimately made by the Governor General based on the advice of the Prime Minister of Canada. Every treaty, declarations of war and peace, those are all powers that don't reside with Parliament, the Parliament of the country or the legislatures of the province, but with the Queen's representative based on the advice of the one person who, based on our rules, has managed to muster enough votes in the People's House. So given how far our current system is from democracy, I think that sort of has to be a starting point, not to mention the very massive issues relating to colonization of Indigenous lands and how far we are from the traditional systems of government that prevailed in this place, in Lekwungen territory, but also in the hundreds of different Indigenous traditions in what we would now call Canada. So a baby step we can take towards more democracy is to move towards a more proportional system of government and to ensure that the composition of the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia better reflects the will of the people as reflected in their decisions on election day. If we're only going to let people vote once every 4 years, I added up when I was, back when I was 18, I think my first letter to the editor said that we were a day and a half away from a democracy. And it was right after I had voted in my first election. It was probably the 1996 provincial election here in BC. And I was 18, and I basically added it up, even accounting for, let's say it takes an hour to get to the polling station and back. If you add up all of the provincial and federal elections in a person's lifetime, you basically have a day and a half of actually participating. Now, if you're fortunate enough to become an elected official, then you actually participate in democracy and in governing. But for most people, it's a representative system of government where they basically contract out or delegate their democratic rights to just a handful of representatives. So that's another reason, I think, in favor of at least moving to a more representative system, where if all you're going to get is a day and a half of voting in your whole life, at least get people who represent your interests and who share your values and beliefs and your ideas for how your community should be constituted and what the relationship should be between people in the community and between people and the natural systems that sustain human and non-human life. So I guess those are some preliminary thoughts. To delve a little bit into the preferred system, I think the province of BC is generally moving in a supportable direction. The leverage provided by a minority government, which is an accident in our system of government, but it does happen from time to time. But we see the very positive policies coming out of this somewhat unique situation in BC politics. And I think that gives a window into what kind of policy and what kind of cooperation we could see with a more proportional system. But I think generally the approach is supportable, not being too prescriptive in terms of the type of questions. There will be some really hard work if the vote is successful in terms of what system we end up with. And I personally wasn't a fan of the whole STV model. I didn't like the idea of these massive ridings that would be impossible to door knock. I never would have met Ronnie. If we were in a mega city, if we're amalgamated and I was having to door knock from Langford to Sydney to Ronnie's place in Fairfield, there's no way I would have met Ronnie, because it's simply too big for grassroots community action to make contact with the electors. Similarly, that was my concerns around STR, that if we ended up with a single transferable system, or STV, that we would have, it would be too big for grassroots, people-powered campaign tactics to succeed in the face of more powerful economic interests, particularly big business and development interests, which historically have dominated all levels of government in this country. So I think for me, the preferred model is mixed member proportional. I favor models that don't give too much power to parties, because all parties tend, the longer they're around, the more likely it is that their institutional interests of self-preservation will take priority over the policies and the principles and the values upon which they were founded. So I favor what it's been described as the best loser model of proportional representation, where the unsuccessful candidates who do the best based on the popular vote are awarded what in other systems would be the list seats, so the top-up seats given to the parties that haven't gotten a proportional outcome based on the first past the post. So that would be the candidates, for example, for the Green Party top-up seats, we would look to the voters. So in Victoria Beacon Hill, where I think the candidate got close to a quarter of the vote, that Kaylin Harris would be in the Legislative Assembly as one of the Green members. And that would empower the voters of Victoria Beacon Hill to elect a Green MLA rather than transferring that power to the apparatchiks of the Green Party. And even as a new party, new and old parties, over time they do develop apparatchiks, and a part of democracy is to rein them in, whether their button is orange or green or any other colors. And my personal preferences are those two colors. But that's a little bit of editorializing. So I think ultimately what you can do, I'm sure Ronnie is getting the message across, we all have to be in the trenches. I think here in the South Island, there's a good chance that there will be a favorable vote But we still have to work hard in our own ridings, and we also have to think of what steps we can take in the more marginal areas of the province where attitudes are less progressive, where public opinion may be more susceptible to the arguments against proportional representation that's pushed by vested economic interests. So what steps can we take to amplify that impact province-wide? Is it sending people up carpooling to the Comox Valley or to Parksville or Qualicum on a weekend to speak to the benefits of PR and knock on doors there? Is it trips to the Lower Mainland? And I'm sure this is all strategies and tactics that the team that put on tonight's event are discussing. So I look forward to door knocking in support of proportional representation. I hope you all get involved starting today. As I said, as a first step towards more democracy in this community and in this province, but let's not rest on our laurels. Once we win PR, there's a heck of a lot more we can do to build a genuine democracy that puts people and the planet before profit. So thank you.
Thank you, Ben. We're going to have a little bit of a change in venue here for our live audience. I'm going to direct your attention to the screen. We had a number of people who really wanted to talk to us tonight, but were not able to come in person. So we have some video endorsements. And it's also a chance if you want to nip outside and grab a wrap or a dessert or a drink. We have some things outside. And we have tea at the bar in the back as well. So after that, we will be having a student panel, which should be lively and fill up all these seats here.
Hello, my name is Marie Rankin. I'm the Member of Parliament for Victoria. I'm really sorry I couldn't be here tonight. I'm in Ottawa, but I wanted you to know that I respect enormously the work that you're doing to try to bring about proportional representation in our country. This fall, you'll have the opportunity to vote for proportional representation in the province of British Columbia. I encourage you to join me in doing so we can make our democracy better. My name is Marie Rankin. I'm the Member of Parliament for Victoria. I'm very excited to be able to have the opportunity to vote for proportional representation this fall in my province of British Columbia. I ran in the last election, and many people were excited about the Liberals' promise to make that election the last one that would be fought under the old first-past-the-post rules, because they knew that their voices would be better represented if there was some form of proportional representation. And that's why it was so disappointing when Justin Trudeau broke that promise. A lot of young people in particular came to me and they said, I'm disillusioned with Canadian democracy. Nothing will change. My vote doesn't count. And I don't think that has to be. And I want to encourage young people in particular to not give up, to work with us to try to achieve a better voting system, a system that will result in higher voter turnout, a system that will result in more women and minorities being represented in Parliament, and therefore the diversity of Canada better reflected. That's what we need to achieve, and that's what proportional representation will help us do. I hope you will join me in the fall to vote for proportional representation in British Columbia.
Hi folks, we really wish we could be there, but we have a lot of important work on the ground we're up to. The BC Federation of Students represents over 130,000 students from across the province at 13 different colleges and universities. It was clear when representatives from all these institutions chose to sign on to the Vote PR BC campaign that students know what a better future for BC looks like. Students are often pushed aside when election season rolls around under a first-past-the-post system because candidates think we don't have the power at the ballot box or a certain riding is a safe seat and they don't need to engage with new voters. In reality, what we saw in the most recent provincial election is that students do vote, we do care, and our issues demand to be heard. That is why we are coming together for this great cause, because the way that we make a brighter future is the same way the BCFS has gotten major wins for students recently. Together, students are standing in support of proportional representation because we know it will make a better British Columbia.
Under our current system, parties that get 40% of the vote can get 60% of the seats and 100% of the power. BC should have a voting system that puts people first. A system where, first and foremost, every person's vote counts, not just the people at the top. A system built on important values like strong local representation, working together, and respect. With proportional representation, government will be more accountable and will work for people on the issues they care about, improving services like education and health, making life more affordable and creating good jobs for British Columbians. It's time to update British Columbia to a fairer system. It's time for proportional representation.
Hi, my name is Arjun Singh. I'm a Kamloops City Councillor. I was born and raised in Kamloops. Spent most of my life here. I support proportional representation because I believe the communities we live in are much more diverse than they ever have been. And I also believe that it's important for political parties to try and work much more closely together. We don't live in a society where we're only Liberals, New Democrats, or Greens. We live in a society where everybody is here, and it's important that our public policy reflects that. So it's important also for us to have civility, respect, and sort of a collaborative method in our politics. And I don't see that very much at provincial and federal levels. It's important that we all get out and vote for the referendum, and I hope everybody will vote for pro-rep when it comes up.
Hi, my name's Shane Dirks, and I live in Nelson, but originally I am from Holland. I immigrated to Canada in 1982. I was always a bit of a political junkie at home, but first years here I didn't pay much attention, you know, gotta establish yourself. Eventually though I did, and then it really happened when I saw watching the election outcome on TV one night and noticed that the popular vote didn't match how many politicians were elected, and that seemed awfully strange to me because I came from Holland, and we had a straight proportional system where that's a direct connection. So that seemed strange, and then I started to watch politics more, and I saw these politicians yelling at each other, screaming at each other, getting personal, getting mean, and I thought, that can't be the best way to make decisions in all our interest. So I came across Fair Vote Canada. I got involved in 2 referendums to try to change the system, and here I am now. And I have to say that over time I have started to appreciate some aspects of our current system, mainly the fact that we have local representation, and that there is somebody who you send to Victoria to represent you, even though, of course, mostly they go to Victoria and then they come back and they start to represent Victoria to you. But the idea is good. So, and I like it that in the current referendum that all the 3 systems, all the 3 proportional systems we get to vote on include that local representation. And on top of that they build a layer of proportionality in different ways. Don't really matter, doesn't really matter so much. We keep that local representation, we'll get proportional results. I think it'll make politics better. Won't solve everything, but it will make politics better. We'll get better decisions, and I definitely hope that you will support it coming this November in our referendum. Thank you.
My name is Josie Howard. I'm originally from New Zealand, but I've been in Canada the last 10 or so years, and in Kamloops for the last 3 years. I currently work at the City of Kamloops in sustainability, and I have a 1-year-old daughter. In New Zealand, we'd had a 2-party system for about 50 years before the public decided that it was time for a change, and we had a referendum in 1993 where the public voted to change to MMP, which is a mixed member proportional voting system. So that came into effect in 1996, and since then it's stayed strong. In 2011 there was a follow-up referendum to see if New Zealanders wanted to maintain the MMP system, and voters overwhelmingly said yes. With MMP you get 2 votes. So you have 1 vote for your electorate, so for whoever is in your area where you live, who'd like to vote for to represent you in Parliament. And then you have a second vote, which is called the party vote. And that's what really makes the system proportionate. So in New Zealand, this has meant that it's really kind of moderated the power that the major parties hold. Often in order to get into government, they will need to form a coalition with one or more minor parties. And so that means that voters who have voted for those minor parties might see their policies actually being implemented. Well, firstly, they would notice a dramatic change in who is represented in government. So an example from New Zealand was in 1990, before the referendum and MMP, the Green Party in New Zealand got 7% of the votes, but they got 0 seats because it was first past the post. If you go forward to 2002 with 7% of the votes, that meant 8 seats in Parliament. So it really makes a huge difference. Yeah, so it's quite interesting in New Zealand, and I imagine everywhere else with proportional voting. If you need a coalition, then it's really important to have a really cooperative relationship between parties. So even before elections, for example, the two more leftist parties in New Zealand, the Green Party and the New Zealand Labour Party, already had kind of showed a platform of what policies they were agreeing on prior to the election, and so that voters know in advance, if a coalition is formed, these are the kind of policies that will be implemented that share both the values of those two parties. It definitely can work here. I think New Zealand and BC have a lot of similarities. We have similar populations. New Zealand is about 4.5 million people, and we kind of have similar geographies and economies in some ways. New Zealand has a lot of primary resource industries as well as like agriculture and tourism, and it definitely works with that size of population base. It can work here. It works in many countries around the world. So I think it would be a great move for BC to move to more proportional voting, and also to encourage more voters to get out and vote, just knowing that their vote is not going to be wasted. It would be represented in the government.
Amazing university students, and tonight we're going to discuss why PR matters to this generation. All right, we have 4 students here, a history major, Regan Dunnick, sorry. Thanks, Regan. Joel Sater is our political science student and also a student of mine. To my immediate right here is Cheyenne Yanni de Luna Bueno, who is an Asia Pacific Studies student. And then lastly, Malcolm McLaren, who's a student of psychology. All right, to begin, first question is over to you, Joel. Mm-hmm. When did you realize that a different voting system for BC was vital?
Interesting question. I think, because I've always been a very curious person by nature. I've always questioned everything around me that I see and experience. And, when you kind of go to school and you learn about the elections and the popular vote and the seats, which is something that we're talking about a lot tonight, you realize how off it is and just how, blatantly odd that is that we still have it. So I think that's when I realized, that it wasn't something that fit in the 21st century, because we're in a democracy and we always frame ourselves as one of the best democracies in the world. Canada's wonderful in all those ways, and then really when you look at the how distorted some of the results can be, it just didn't add up to me. So that's how I realized that, yeah.
Interesting. Thanks, Joel. Okay, Reagan. Now, what about the current system makes you the most dissatisfied?
The current system has created a government that I can't see myself in. As
one down.
It is. I'm going to let you handle that. Okay. The current system has created a government that I can't see myself in. You know, I'm a young black woman. I cover many minority boxes, and yet there's no one, I think, in government looking out for issues that are specific to me or other minority cultures. So the first past the post system, under that system, there's about 70% of votes that aren't as useful as they could be under the proportional representation system. So I think for me, it's like, it shouldn't be dependent on what riding you're in or what direction your riding is leaning. Your vote should be as valid as everyone else's vote. And I think it's so important, especially in this generation where modern media has allowed for, you know, Facebook and Snapchat and Twitter. We all have a voice within the media system, but we still don't have a voice within government.
Thank you. Cheyenne, your family immigrated to Canada, and given that experience of immigrating and living in other places, how would you say that shaped your opinion of electoral systems?
Well, initially coming to this country, we didn't really have like the options like here where you can have like PR. So that really affected, because it was either you choose the government or you choose the military, you're going to be with the rebels or not. So having something in Canada, really having like even just like representation of a group, because I came from like a minority group where unfortunately we got gunned down, and majority of my family did, is really super important to get our voices heard. And given with like the recent influx of like immigrants, like we do make up a bunch of like the labor. Most of people here coming to Canada are now immigrants, and I think it's like super important to also have our voices heard too, because we make up a lot of the country as well, to support you guys.
Great, thank you very much. That's a really interesting angle. Now Malcolm, you're a psychology student, so what do you think the sort of psychological weight of feeling like your vote just doesn't make a difference?
Well, in my opinion, this is a prime example of B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning, where, thank you, over time, an average voter is shaped to believe their vote doesn't count or doesn't matter. A positive reinforcer being their disillusionment through several elections. I would say that would be.
Okay, always nice to quote B.F. Skinner. Okay, Joel, what do you think, and this is a fairly straightforward question, what do you think the biggest benefit of changing our voting system might be?
I would say the biggest benefit would be that all the voices are heard more. So you have to cooperate, because people do want cooperation, but they also want stability. And what I get a lot on the doorstep, because I canvass with Fair Vote quite a bit, is that PR is unstable, and it creates a lot of minority situations, which are that's where you get your cooperation from. And what I like to tell people is that with PR, we are making majorities. It's just majorities with more than one party. So it is cooperative, and that's the biggest thing. And not just that, but like just the fact that it's just the right thing to do. It's just democratic. But also, if you want to get into like the results and the reasoning behind that, it would be cooperation.
Right.
Yeah.
So a government that actually cooperates.
Yeah. And look, yeah, like Europe. You know, most of Europe does that. Okay. And most places do that are advanced. The OECD is I forget what that stands for, but someone maybe correct me on that later. But it's like all the major democracies in the world, kind of all the Western developed countries, and like over 80% of them use PR, and we don't, so it makes sense to me. And it's all because of cooperation.
Okay, great, thanks very much. All right, Reagan, you're a history student. Lots of times there's been some of the opposition to a changing in voting system will say, kind of look back and say, well, it's our tradition. We've had this system since Confederation. Oh, we can't break with tradition. What would you say to that kind of sentiment?
Well, as a history student, my entire field of study is based on precedent. And even though we have a precedent for something, it doesn't make it logical or even moral. And as history will show, you know, we once had a tradition of not letting women vote. We once had a tradition of not letting Indigenous peoples vote. We've interned people. And we've looked back at that as an embarrassing point in our history. And I think it's time for First Past the Post to join that and time for us to move into the future. We need a new tradition, I think, for the generation that's going to be living with it.
Okay. A new tradition then. Okay. Cheyenne, a similar kind of question. Lots of folks will say, well, you know, our electoral system is pretty good. You know, how do you respond to people in BC who are like, oh, pretty good is good enough?
I would respond with what's actually really good. Is it good for, like, majority of people of European descent? Is it good for the Indigenous people of BC? Because I don't hear their voices talked, or any of the immigrants' voices talked either. So I don't, like, for you, what is your interpretation of pretty good? Because for me, pretty good is not good enough, because we're gonna have because if it's pretty good, I wouldn't have to have this question right now also.
That was a better than pretty good answer. All right, Malcolm, and because this is a student panel, and students have a vantage point that I think is unique to help guide us for the future. As a student, Malcolm, why is PR, proportional representation in all its variations, why is it important to you?
Well, it's important to me personally because a lot of my friends and peers are pretty disengaged with the political system right now. They feel like they're not represented, and they are completely lost as to who to vote for, or if they should vote at all. I feel that proportional representation would give them that chance to really come back and engage with their political landscape.
So a change in the voting scenery might bring them back to the table.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Joel, you're pretty active. You've knocked on a lot of doors. Mm-hmm. Why is it vital to get involved in the referendum?
Well, for this particular referendum here in BC, this is probably going to be the last attempt. This is the third time, so if it doesn't happen, it may be a very long time before it ever happens again. I probably won't see it in my lifetime. So, and it's vitally important. BC is the third largest province in Canada, and a lot of the times things snowball. So if BC got it, whisperings of it would happen across the country, and it could perhaps happen in other provinces, and maybe someday nationally too. So it is hopefully right. So yeah, it's really our only chance to do this, and we can make a big impact on the rest of Canada.
So just to go back on this, so you said it may not happen again, so you're kind of saying it's now or never. If it doesn't happen here, as a political scientist, like, does that mean it doesn't happen in Ontario? Or where we just saw a government elected with another majority with 39 or 38, you know, majority kind of government? Like, what does it mean to not just British Columbia, but maybe to Canada, if we don't get out there and knock on doors and make it happen?
Interesting question. I like how you called me a political scientist. Like I'm done. Like
You're not done.
No, nowhere near. So you're asking,
what's the larger impact?
What's the larger impact? Well, like Doug Ford, right? Or Trump even. And I mean, they have the they use the electoral college, which I don't even understand. But but it is based on plurality, first past the post system. He didn't win the vote. And that often happens here too. And you know, just like in Ontario, because you mentioned it, it was 60% of the public wanted to keep the health, like didn't want to do the cuts and the buck a beer thing, most of the you know, they wanted the progressive policies throughout. There was the other three parties, but together it was the majority, and that's not what they're getting. So people are not getting it right. They're not getting a good deal of what they have elected.
Okay. Thanks very much. All right, Cheyenne. Now, people are always saying, especially in the social media age, how distracted and how busy they are, and how there's so many things pulling at them, especially younger people. There's all these other pressures. Why do you think it's worth people taking the time to learn more about electoral systems? Like, why does this matter?
I think it matters because everyone should be aware of where their vote goes to, whether it counts or not, instead of just like throwing your vote away, which is a lot of young people do, where they just kind of like do whatever their peers kind of say. So for me, honestly, it's just important that I'll like, especially with our generation, where our vote counts toward, because it's our future, it's everyone's future. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay. This is the last question. And originally here, I had it for Reagan, but I'd like you all to think about this, because I think the point of this panel today is to get a certain viewpoint from a certain position in people's lives. These are all students. They're all relatively young. They're all bright. They're all just starting to engage as citizens. I'll first ask you, Reagan, but then I'll expand it to the rest of the panel if you want to chime in. As a student, what message do you hope that maybe older generations who are watching or are listening, what do they really hear from what we've discussed tonight?
I think it's important to consider that there are many generations after you that will be living with that decision for decades. And it can seem kind of vague maybe, and maybe you're not in tune with the younger generations, you don't feel connected to them. I know a lot of people in the younger generations don't feel connected to the older generation. So if you need to, I think it would be an important thing to maybe personalize it. Think about not the younger generation as a whole. What do you want your grandchildren to be living with, 20 years down the line? What kind of government do you want to be running their lives? What kind of environment do you want them to be living in? And really consider that. I mean, voter turnout is huge within the older generations, and we know that the youth vote isn't as high as we want it to be, and I think this is a great opportunity for youth to get involved. It's finally something that they can be really involved in and really personal with. I think the idea of having proportional representation and having someone who's genuinely interested in issues that you consider close to you are so important, especially to the youth culture. Having our voices heard is so key, and I think if the older generation were to support that, there would be such an incredible amount of community created between the two to create an environment in which we could both live kind of quite peacefully now and well into the future.
Oh, that's an amazing answer. Does anyone else want to chime in on what message they might have for their grandparent and uncle and aunt? Joel?
Yeah, personally. So, like, I get that, people are naturally afraid of change. I get that, like, change is a big thing, right? But at the end of the day, we pretty much always have, this sounds like a really slimy politician answer, but basically at the end of, just a heads up, but basically, but at the end of the day, like, people pretty much always, Canadians basically share like the same overall values. Like, we believe in fairness in this country, right? Look at we have universal health care. That's like the top thing that we all believe in, like we champion around the world. And we have a social welfare state that's still somehow around despite everything we've gone through. So, we have a lot of common fairness in our blood as a nation. So you may be afraid of change, especially changing a system like this. I get that, because you voted the same way forever. But it really is a time to bring out that inner kind of Canadian values that we have. I know that sounds like Kelly Leach, but no, really. But this actually is. So fairness is a big thing that we have in our country. So and it would really bring that out for everybody.
Anyone else?
Y'all just want to live, man.
All right.
Yeah, I would say think about the things that you thought were normal when you were part of youth culture. Youth culture isn't new to this generation. Every single person has gone through their own kind of youth movement. and think about the things that you thought were normal at that time and how they've changed over the years. And I think it's time for us as this generation to experience that level of change. We need a sort of revolution as such. You guys got it in the 60s, it's time for us now.
Malcolm?
Change doesn't have to be as scary as you think it is. I mean, I think it's time, and I think it's time to get interested again.
Okay. Well, I think you want to welcome or congratulate this amazing and insightful and courageous panel. Let's thank them for their incredible insights tonight. Okay, I think we can.
Anyway.
Mr. McGregor, the Member of Parliament for Hi everyone, I'm Alistair McGregor, the Member of Parliament for Cowichan Malahat Langford, and I'm here to tell you that I am an enthusiastic supporter for proportional representation. I'm really sorry I couldn't be with you today, but my duties in Ottawa require me to be in the House of Commons on behalf of my constituents. But that being said, I hope you have a fantastic rally. I hope everyone leaves this event totally enthusiastic about the job ahead, and let's get this province moving for the change we need to see. Thanks so much. BC's got an amazing event coming up because we actually have an opportunity where every resident of British Columbia is going to be able to make a decision on what kind of voting system they would like to use to elect their MLAs to the provincial legislature. So proportional representation is going to be a great system for British Columbia because I'll expand it to what happens with countrywide in Canada. So with our current first-past-the-post system, it allows various political parties to concentrate their efforts in specific geographic regions. So they may, for example, just concentrate on the province of Quebec, maybe Southern Ontario, and if they do that, that's their electoral key to victory. They don't really need to concentrate on the rest of Canada. And so if you boil that down to British Columbia, under our current system, political parties may only be able to concentrate their efforts in specific areas, and that's the key to victory. When you have a proportional representation system, and in British Columbia, it means every vote is going to count equally. Every single vote, no matter what part of this great province you live in, is up for grabs. So you're going to have parties who may have been confined to Vancouver Island, may have been confined to the interior or to the lower mainland. They're going to have to reach out of their traditional power bases and go to every single region. So I think the people of British Columbia, under a PR system, are going to notice a lot more attention being paid to them and their respective issues by every single political party, and I think that's a great thing. So the characteristics of proportional representation that make it suitable for British Columbia, well, I'll expand that to Canada, because what we see in Canada is that with our current first-past-the-post system is it favors parties that can concentrate their vote in specific geographic areas. So if you can lock down the vote, say in Quebec or Southern Ontario, you don't need to pay attention to the rest of Canada. We can boil that down to British Columbia. You know, if parties are only concentrating their get-out-the-vote efforts or their support in certain areas of the province, they tend to ignore other areas. With proportional representation, you have to fight for every single vote in all regions of this province. So it means every British Columbian is going to actually have political parties coming to them, seeking out their support, and it will mean regional issues, rural issues, urban issues are all going to be kind of on an equal footing, because political parties are going to have to compete equally on every part of the province. One common misunderstanding with first past the post is that people, I think, really feel that I don't want to say that, you know, governments elected by it are illegitimate, but I think they may feel that it's an equal system. Like they say, well, we all get to vote, our votes are counted equally, and yes, in the riding they are counted equally. But when you expand that nationwide, where some political parties, like let's look at what the Green Party has done. They got 600,000 votes nationally, but got rewarded with 1 seat. And so it's the fact that when you count up all the votes and you look at the number of seats that it took for each vote to get, well, those are not equal. And so the misconception is that people do feel that their vote counts equally under first past the post, but when you look at the evidence, that's actually not true. What I would say to British Columbians about this upcoming referendum is that you have a truly historic moment upon you, and I really urge you to really carefully think about this, because you have an opportunity to establish a precedent in a very large province that has considerable influence on the rest of the country. And I feel strongly that if we are to go forward to impose, or not impose, but to implement a system where people feel their votes are counting equally, and that could set a precedent for the rest of the country. And I really think that would put added pressure on the federal parties for the election in 2019. So supporters of the proportional representation system, when they're trying to conduct this campaign, you've got to use all the tools. You've got to talk to your family, your friends, you've got to use social media. Sign up with local campaigns, figure out what Fair Vote BC is doing, and there's going to be all kinds of community events everywhere in this province. And if you want to get involved, we have so many tools at our disposal. I mean, I look at what I do as a politician and the ways I communicate with my constituents, whether through social media, going to community events, going out door knocking. There are countless ways. I think the best way is to go to one of the websites, click on the contact links, and you'll have someone who's really helpful guide you through that process. So I just want to take this moment to thank all British Columbians who are engaged in this process. You know, as a politician, one of the things that I really love about my job is when you have communities that are really engaged in the issues that matter. And I think this is one of the big ones. So I just really personally want to extend that thanks to the people of British Columbia for getting to learn about this issue, for coming to understand why it's so important. And let's hope that we really make the change that not only our province needs to see, but Canada as well. Thanks so much.
My name is Leslie Lax, and I am absolutely in favour of proportional representation. I grew up in apartheid South Africa, where 80% of the population did not have the right to vote. They didn't have the democratic right to determine their current and future circumstances. And every time I voted, I was painfully aware of those whose ideas and values were excluded from decision making. In Canada and British Columbia, all citizens of 18 years and older have the right to vote. But our current system still leaves so many effectively excluded from decision making. For many, their votes just don't count. First past the post is an adversarial system that generally creates an all or nothing government, one that does not represent the pattern of voting of the electorate. The party with the majority of seats gets to form government, and all other ideas are left out in the cold. This even where 50% or more voters did not vote for the party in power. Proportional representation is an electoral system that better reflects voters' choices.
Hi, I'm Gisela Ruckert, and I'm a big fan of proportional representation. I came to support electoral reform when I was working with small grassroots environmental groups. And polling was consistently showing that most people agreed with us, that they wanted to see more significant action on climate change, for example. But government policy was ignoring that consensus. And I realized that it's the way our government works that allows that situation to happen. When governments are elected by 30 or 40% of the voters, they have to keep that base happy. And it leads to shorter term thinking and possibly less effective policy outcomes. Personally, I think that better decisions are made when more perspectives are represented in the room. Under proportional representation, government policy reflects what the majority of people want to see happen. And that's a big improvement over our current system.
Hi, my name's Anne Remnant, and I live in Nelson with my husband. And I never considered myself a political person at all. I just saw politicians yelling at each other all the time. Whatever one party did, the other one undid or criticized, and it seemed like we never really got anywhere. And then I found out about proportional representation, and that piqued my interest. And it's the first political issue that I've really ever been involved in. Another thing that I saw is that a lot of my friends were protesting things all the time, protesting pipelines or protesting poverty or whatever, you name it, whatever issue. And even though politicians promise to address those issues when they're in an election campaign, once they got elected, the story changed. And we see that over and over and over again. During elections, things get really nasty, especially in partisan politics, with neighbors hating each other, yelling at each other, trying to force each other to do something that the other one wants them to do. And it's terrible. It takes months to recover from those kind of experiences. So I look at proportional representation as a first step in improving our politics. There's many more things that have to happen, but this is a first small step. It's easy change for voters, and I think it will be actually a nicer change for politicians. Politicians who probably go into it because they really care and they really want to make a difference, and they get into the system and they get eaten up by the system and they turn into robots, puppets of the party. So yeah, I think we can do a lot better. We deserve a lot better, and I look forward to having a proportional voting system in BC in 2021. Thank you.
Small place. I met Ben on the doorstep. Well, I also met Frances recently through our common interest of local theater. We met in the theater. And I knew she kind of looked familiar. And then I kind of put two together that I recognized her as a Green Party candidate in the federal election in Esquimalt, Saanich-Gulf, and because I'd been at a rally there, and it was, great to see that people I meet at the theater are active politically. Frances is a journalist, a photographer, and an award-winning local leader. She created a group called Creatively United for the Planet, and that group is dedicated to sharing solutions for a healthier community. Let's welcome Frances to talk to us.
Good evening. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I have to admit, prior to being invited to run in the 2015 election, I actually had not really any interest in politics. That may come as a shock to a few people, but I truly didn't. Other than voting, I saw politics as kind of boring, as something that other people did, that we paid these people really good money to do a job for us. So I didn't really have to be that involved, did I? So, I think that we can all maybe relate to the fact that we're busy, we have lives, and life just goes on at this pace. And especially when you're self-employed or you're a student or you're a parent, you understand that this isn't something that we have a lot of time for as a rule. But over time, I began to realize that politics affects everything we do and everybody. There was no denying it. So knowing that my hard-earned taxes from everything, affects our education, affects our health care, affects what we wear, what gets imported into the country, what we get to export, what happens to our beautiful old-growth forests, all of that is affected by politics. I began to, over time, to take note. And it really came to my attention even more so when I was approached to run. And another reason why I started Creatively United. But, I don't know if anyone else here has been disappointed with how their hard-earned tax dollars have been spent. Anybody here? Yeah, there's a few people who can say, yeah, I'm not really happy with how my money's being spent, and especially in light of what we're seeing as of recently in the news, that we're going to be investing in something very expensive called a pipeline instead of putting it into healthcare, education, you know, rights, housing, you name it, all the things it could go towards. So we've heard amazing speakers tonight. I can't add a lot of new material. But what I will say, if anyone really wants to understand, on top of what you've heard, how our governments are getting hijacked by the corporations, I highly recommend this book by Kevin Taft called Oil's Deep State. And Kevin Taft was in Alberta politics for 11 years as an MLA and 6 years as leader of the opposition. And boy, does this book, which has just recently come out, ever nail it. So there's no mystery as to what's happening. And I think we're also seeing that the blinders are coming off with the brazen politics that we see in the US of they're just going to do what they darn well want to. And we're starting to see our Canadian government take that stance as well, which, as has been said, is a very frightening proposition. So we can lead the way. And I personally feel because we live and breathe and work and live in one of the most beautiful places in the world, it is our right and our responsibility to really get the word out why this referendum on and what we're going to be doing moving forward with proportional representation must be shared with our families, our friends, our co-workers. And I truly hope you will support Fair Vote BC, because we're so fortunate to have an organization taking the helm, and it's not just up to us as individuals. We have an organization leading the way, and we can all make the difference by helping each other in this movement forward. So here's to proportional representation. Thank you.
Hi there. I'd like to introduce now Elisabeth Gugl. She is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Victoria. Her main research is in family economics. One of the recurring themes in her research is how public policy may influence actions and ultimately the distribution of welfare amongst family members. Well, I was thinking about that statement, and to me it really applies to this issue of proportional representation. And my goal here in the next few months is to give Elisabeth a chance to study firsthand how the introduction of a proportional representation government here in BC will affect the economics of our families in BC, and I want her to have a chance to study that live. So here's Elisabeth, and I think she's going to be introducing other people to the stage. I think she's got something fun for us, so let's see.
Hello, everybody. So I brought some slides, but I also have big visuals. I was trying to come up with a way to help us all understand how the three different versions of proportional voting might impact the kinds of people that we elect in terms of rural, urban, suburban, like regional aspects, and also in terms of what kind of parties and are getting into government. And so as you will see, because there are three different versions that you can choose from, depending on with the same voters' preferences and the same way in which people would vote for a particular party, we will actually get quite different results depending on which of the three versions we pick. So what I'm trying to do is just pick the 87 seats that we have right now and show you how they would be allocated differently with the different voting rules that we have in place, assuming that people always vote for the same parties in all of the different elections, okay? And in order to do that, Thea will help me. She's my daughter, and she will hold up some signs for me. Okay, so because quite a bit is being made of the question about regional representation, In my example, what I have is, come over here, Thea, and hold this up for me. I'm assuming that there are currently electoral districts that are in urban areas, and this is how people vote in each of these districts. So I'm assuming a very homogeneous population to make these examples quite easy to follow. And I picked vegetables so that we are not thinking about current parties, but just the principles that are behind the different voting rules when we think about the outcomes. So I have a small party that gets consistently 5% of the vote in each of the districts. I have, and then 3 larger parties where one dominates the other one, but by not that much. So we have the Peace Party with 35%, the yams with 30%, lettuce with 30%, and then the beans just gets 5%, okay? So all these rectangles here are the different electoral districts in urban areas. And each of these districts currently under the first past the post system elect 1 member. So when we look at the way people vote for different candidates, right, then we can see that the Peace Party is getting every single seat in all of these 30 electoral districts, okay? In order to get up to 87 seats, I also have suburban areas. And again, here I'm assuming they actually look the same in terms of their voting behavior. Just to make this example simple, you will see that it still gives us different results depending on which voting rule we use, okay? So that's 30 seats for the Peace Party from the urban districts and 30 seats from the suburban districts. That already makes 60 seats for the Peace Party at the moment with first past the post, right? And then I have a remaining 25 electoral districts, that's okay. In this case, I've just reversed the way people vote between Peace and Yams Party. And so the Yams Party here gets 35%, the Peace Party 30%, everything else remains the same. So that means that all these 27 seats go to the Yams Party, okay? So what does this mean? With first past the post, we would have 27 representatives from the Yams Party and 60 representatives from the Peace Party. But when you do the math overall, province-wide, we have the Peace Party is getting 33%, Yams Party 32%, Lettuce Party 30%, and Beans Party 30%, right? And we have no representation from the Lettuce Party or the Beans Party with first past the post, but just these two parties have representatives, okay? Have representatives. So that's the current system with my example, and now I'm going to talk about the dual member proportional voting rule, which is one of the 3 that's on the referendum. In this case, what would happen is that many of the single-member districts at the moment would be amalgamated into 2 seats electoral districts. So that just the neighboring districts would come together. And that would happen for all of the urban, suburban districts, but maybe not for the rural ones. So in my example, I'm assuming this only applies to urban and suburban areas, which gives us 15 districts in the urban areas and also 15 districts in the suburban areas, right? And then in the rural area, nothing changes. We still have 27 electoral districts where 1 seat is elected through first past the post. What this means is that in the rural area, nothing changes and we elect 27 people from the Yams Party. But what happens with the electoral districts in the urban and suburban areas is that only the first of the 2 people in each district is elected by first past the post. So remember, it was the Peace Party who always gets the most vote shares. So they would get 30 seats, but then there are 30 seats remaining, right? Because and these second seats are being allocated based on province-wide vote shares. Okay? So if you have kept track, then we already had 30 members from the Peace Party, and if you do the math, that turns into 34% of the seats. If we go with the Yams Party and the 27, that would turn into 31% of the seats. And so the rest of the seats, the 30 seats that we still need to allocate, when we look at the representation here, then we would allocate 26 seats to the Lettuce Party and 4 seats to the Beans Party, and that's how we end up with a very proportional system. Okay? So that's the dual member proportional rule, one of the 3 rules that's on the referendum. It's fairly easy for people to vote in the system, because if they're in a 2 or 1 member electoral district, all they need to do is vote for 1 party or 1 ticket. In the case where we have 2 seats, it would just be, they would be voting for a combination of 2 people, and otherwise they would be just voting for 1. Okay? And so what happens is that it's not somehow these second seats will be just picked, I guess, randomly in our case, because it's the same situation in all of the different electoral areas, right? And so some of these electoral districts would end up with a second member who is from the Lettuce Party, and some with 1 who is from the Beans Party. Okay? All right. So about the connection between the members that they elect and the region, right? Because in some ways, this second member is quite arbitrarily picked in that sense. So that's why the other proportional voting rules are more tied to geographical areas. But you will also see that this turns it a little bit, makes it a little bit harder for the voting rule to match proportionality in the same way as this first rule does. And these are the trade-offs that people have to think about when they make their choice between the 3 different voting rules. So let me show you how the other ones work. Okay. So the next one is the mixed proportional, mixed member proportional voting rule. And in this case, what would happen is that we form larger electoral districts with just 1 seat, and then also regional voting districts where more than 1 member is elected. And so people would be getting a ballot where they have to choose based on the smaller district they are in, and then also based on the regional district that they are in, who they want in the assembly. So if you think about this visually, if we combine the urban and suburban regions, what this would mean is that we could form, because we want to target 60% of the seats as being from 1 seat electoral districts. So that would mean that we have about 36 smaller electoral districts where people choose just 1 member. And then we would have also 3 regional districts that are just a combination of the smaller districts that we have here, where they also can choose a party. Okay? So with this in mind, then what would happen is that with the 1 member electoral districts, again, the Peace Party would get 35%, and so they get all these members. So that's 36 already. And then we have the regional districts, right, where we can allocate 7 seats. So people would be voting again for all the different parties, and then by using single transferable vote, we would get some more proportionality from these regional districts. And that turns, when you do the math, that turns into 2 seats for the Yams Party and also for the Peace Party, and 3 seats for the Lettuce Party, because I'm assuming that the people who vote for the Beans Party who don't get any seats would be transferring their vote to the Lettuce Party. Okay? So that's how we would end up with this. And then the same thing would also happen with our rural districts. And so we would end up here with 16 seats from the 1-seat electoral districts. And then here again, we would have now, from the rural districts, we would also get members from the other parties, because 2 will be elected from the Yams party, the Peace party, and 3 from the Lettuce party. Okay? So you see, it's quite different. Whether you go with the first proportional voting rule and how people get elected, or if you go with the second one. And then we have a third option that is making a distinction between how people get elected, again, between rural and urban and suburban areas. And now in the urban and suburban area, we only do STV. So what this means is, and again, it's not clear from the proposals exactly how many seats will be allocated to these districts, and that's still up for negotiations. So I picked a number, and I decided to allocate 10 seats to each of these bigger now electoral districts that I formed out of the 60 small districts that we started out with. And then within each of these districts, we allocate the seats based on how people vote for the different parties. Okay? And because the Beans party people who will not get a seat will transfer their vote to the Lettuce party in the end, here also in this example, what could happen is that actually the Lettuce party ends up with 4 seats and the other 2 parties with 3 seats. Okay? Because when it comes to single transferable vote, who you vote second also makes a difference in terms of how seats are being allocated. And then this proposal treats rural areas differently, where it does what we did before, the mixed member proportional, not for the whole province, but now only for the rural districts. And so here we would still have some 1-seat electoral districts, and then we would also have a regional district with, say, 10 seats. Okay? And so if you do the math here, this means that the Yams party is getting 7 seats just from the 1-seat electoral districts, and then they are getting another 3 from this regional district. So in the end, what happens is that depending on the voting rule, we have seen that we are matching proportionality province-wide not as well when we go with the second or the third option as we do with dual member proportional. Why is that the case? Because in the last 2 voting rules, we have fairly small regional electoral districts, and the smaller the number is of seats that you can allocate through STV, the harder it is to actually match proportionality. And the harder it is also for smaller parties to get in. What people need to make a decision on when they vote for one of the 3 proportional voting rules, in case you are already in favor of proportional voting to start out with, you have to then think, how important is it that I tie my representative to a particular area? Because that will then make it a little bit harder to match proportionality overall than if you have bigger voting areas as well. Okay?
Will you take the question?
If there's none, yes?
Is dual member proportionality the most popular in the world at this point? Which is the most popular where it's being used?
So in a lot of countries, there are big voting areas. So basically, you just have, if you have STV on a big enough voting area, you get a proportionality there. The problem is that if you apply to a very small district, you're having a hard time matching it, especially if you also combine it with first past the post, which is what these voting rules do.
So one size doesn't fit all?
No. So if one way to get to regional representation and at the same time also great proportionality is if we were to introduce a bicameral system. Yes, which is what a lot of the countries do, right? Because on the one hand, they have regional representation, 1 for each region, and then we just go by popular vote on the other one.
All right, everyone, thank you very much. We are going to be winding down and moving towards the end of 2020 Vision. Thank you all so much for coming out. But before we wrap up, we have a final game show segment in which I'm going to invite all of you to participate. I can see bright, smiling faces after all of those wonderful lineups, so thank you very much. So if I could get a little bit of excitement going, we've got some wonderful prizes. All right, I'm feeling it. So the way this is going to work is a question is going to pop up on the screen. If you'd like to answer, please put your hand up. I'll invite you to the front of the stage so that we can hear you on the microphone, and you can give me your answer. And if you're right or if you're wrong, we're going to give you a prize. So think about that. All right, can I please get the first question? All right. So since 1952, 16 of the last 17 elections have seen the winning party gain 50% of the seats. So how many times has that winning party had 50% or more of the popular vote? What seems reasonable to you? Was that, I want a hand. Right there. Can I get you up to the front of the stage, please, to share your answer? So what do you think it is?
It's D.
D, once. That is correct. Only once has a party with 50% of the more of the votes had that much, that share of the popular vote.
And
Thank you.
That was actually Liberal Party.
Yes.
Also won all the rest of them.
Yeah, it was. It was. Oh, and we can get your prize if you go over here. Eleanor can help you out. All right, next question, please. All right, so in 2005, the Liberals had 75,000, or 4%, more votes than the NDP. How many more voters would have had to change their vote to create an NDP majority instead of the other way around? What's that? You want to come up here and tell your answer into the mic? So of all the choices, 150,000 votes, 75,000 votes, 25,000 votes, or just 1,300 votes?
I say it's D.
It's D, only 0.07%? That's correct. All right. Everyone, let's give it a hand up. Thank you very much. And you can go get a gift. All right. Next question, please. So, question number 3. Over 4 elections, a party has slowly lost support, going from 45% to 43% to 41%, finally ending at 39%. This is a hypothetical. Not really, but imagine that. Party slowly losing sway. What would be the percentage of the seats this party won in each election? So it's losing power. What seems reasonable to you? A, B, C, or D? Oh, right here, up in front. What do you think it is?
I believe it's C.
I believe it's C. C looks a little bit wonky. Be expected. The answer is actually D. And you can see it's going all over the place. 39%. It's not following the popular trend at all. But thank you so much for coming up, and we can get you a prize anyway. Right there. All right. Another question. So, in BC's electoral history, what percentage of the popular vote was needed to reduce the opposition to just 2 seats? We're going to hold off on you. We're going to give somebody else. Right there at the back, can I get you up to the front? What's your name? Cheryl. Cheryl? All right, Cheryl, let's do this. So, what was the population?
58% D.
58%. That is correct. All right, so thank you so much, Cheryl. You can go help yourself to a gift over there at the table. All right. So in BC's last election, what percentage of voters determined the outcome of the election? So that is to say, which percentage of voters elected the winning party? We have someone in the back. Would you like to come up? Yes? And we actually have a few more prizes, so we can get one more person if they think they know the answer. Or she can just clean up all of them. So what do you think the answer is?
D.
That's correct. The answer is D. Only 30% of the popular vote. All right, so you can go help yourself. Thank you so much. All right, our last question. In BC's electoral history, what percentage of the vote has been needed to form government? Or rather, what is the lowest percentage of the vote that has been needed to form a government? Now, you might think it's somewhere around 50%. What are we thinking? So I heard someone mumbling out there. Who would like to win a prize? Probably D. What's your name, sir? Larry. Larry, probably D. You are correct. All right. So, Larry, you can make your way up to the table and help yourself to a gift. And you know what? You can probably even grab another one for someone special. Yeah. So we can see that all of these answers have not really been what we'd expect, and that's part of the problem of first past the post. So that's it for us tonight, folks. I would like to end by acknowledging so many of the people that were instrumental in making this happen. First of all, Sunset Labs, whose support was phenomenal, and without whose help we would not be here tonight. Thank you so much, Sunset Labs. I would also like to thank Scott Vannon for supplying some of our wonderful prizes that some of you are going to be taking home. Thank you very much, Scott Vannon. As well as Ken Gray. Ken Gray is a member of Fair Vote Canada for Kamloops. He was responsible for some of the cinematography that went on during the half. So thank you so much, Ken, where you are. Finally, all of the speakers, wonderful, some of them who had to run. Elisabeth May is no longer here, but all of you wonderful people who came out, contributed your time, your expertise into helping inform us and helping inform all of the people watching at home. Thank you so much. We could not have done this without you. And finally, not on this list, but equally, if not the most important, is in this corner over here, Eleanor Vannon, who put this entire event together. Give it up for Eleanor Vannon. All right, thank you so much, everyone. This has been Vision 2020, an evening on electoral reform. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.